Hello and welcome, everyone. Today, as we've been doing over the past day or so, we're going to look deeply into context. I think it almost goes without saying for people working on climate security issues that context matters. Context shapes the way in which we respond to issues, but it also allows us to be able to craft them properly, whether it's identifying the root causes, looking beyond the correlations and symptoms, and really trying to put our finger on the pulse of the issues that we deal with. The people that you're going to hear from this morning are people that work within these contexts from different points of view. They cover Africa. So this session this morning, continent. Chitra Nagajaran will speak to Mali, but also broader context around her work in the Sahel and the Lake Chad Basin. She's an independent researcher with extensive experience on climate security. C.B. Lawson Marriott will speak about the experiences of the World Food Programme in providing humanitarian assistance, but also technical support on context across the African continent. Ashraf Usman from Nigeria will share experiences from Nigeria as well, focusing specifically on the work that he does as a conflict and political economy specialist with UNDP. Janelle B. Galvanek will share experiences from Somalia, drawing on her experiences working as the head of department for General Regional Peace Support for the Berghoff Foundation. But before we go into those local contexts, Lucas Rutiger, Senior Advisor at Adelphi, will provide us our first contextual take, looking specifically into why it is we even bother to have risk analysis, and importantly, showcasing the methodology of weathering risk. Without wasting any more of your time, I hand over to you, Lucas.
Very much. Is this working? Hello? Yeah. Very good. Yeah, very well welcome from my side as well. I'm very happy to be here on the panel with all of you. I'm very excited about the discussion. And I just want to really briefly introduce weathering risk and kind of frame the discussion through that, because that's been kind of the framework through which we have been working with all the people here on the panel. So the weathering risk was launched under the Berlin Call to Action in summer 2020 by the German Foreign Minister. And it's really a multidisciplinary and multilateral affair, and it's led by Adelphi and the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. And we have a whole range of partner institutions working closely together, and many of them here on the panel with me. And it's also supported by the German Foreign Office, but also Denmark, Norway, Ireland, and the UK. And the goal of the initiative is really threefold. So it's one of the goals is to inform planning, to really enhance capacity, and then improve operational responses to climate security risks, especially on the ground. And it has really a broad spectrum of target groups, so anyone really working on climate or conflict or the intersection, but especially policymakers and practitioners. And the first step in this kind of process or endeavor is better assessment. So to really ensure that strategy, planning, and projects are grounded in an evidence-based analysis of climate-related security risks. So this initiative really tries to improve our knowledge of how climate impacts and conflict risks are linked, in very specific contexts, as Ottilia said, and kind of what concrete actions can be taken to prevent or reduce those risks once you have that kind of contextual understanding. And the way we approach it, we developed a methodology that is really adaptable and replicable, a climate security assessment methodology. And it's really based on the state of the art, what's out there on the one side on kind of climate impact research, on vulnerability assessments, as well as conflict analysis, plus the kind of experiences and lessons learned that we've collected in the past years on how to do these kind of analysis. And it's really important to underline that it builds on top of what's out there and kind of combines it in new and innovative ways. And at the heart of this approach is really a mixed method approach. So on the one hand, we use the best available climate impact data. So we have, through the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, a great partner who provides us with this data. They run over 10 models, and they give us projections on precipitation change, temperature change, but also impacts on water availability, on agriculture. And then we combine that really with a thorough analysis of the peace and security context. And the crucial part of that is field research. It's qualitative field research, going out there, doing as many interviews as we can, and really focusing on those groups and individuals that are normally not part of these kind of assessments. And then we bring these two sides together, so the quantitative climate impact data with this really thorough understanding of the local context. And we don't just overlay risks, we really try to understand how climate change impacts conflict drivers and how conflict undermines the resilience and increases the vulnerability of groups to conflict risks. And this is really informed by what we already know about climate-related security risks. So it's informed by a number of prototypical climate security pathways that we've identified and that are kind of the starting point for our analysis. So they help us to really explore how climate change impacts conflicts around natural resources, how it impacts livelihood insecurity, or how it impacts migration. And then lastly, I want to underline one more point, and the key component of this approach is really the focus on key context factors that translate climate into conflict risks. So at the heart of our approach, of this climate security approach, is really governance, exclusion, and marginalization. So, for example, we really try to understand how gender, ethnicity, age, and disability intersect and shape these kind of risks.
Thank you very much, Lucas. This is a conversation this morning, so please remember, if you are going to tweet, you must tweet at ClimateDiplo and use the hashtag BCSC 2022. Lucas has laid the scene, so to speak, but what he's purposefully not done is he's purposefully not used examples. So the task for you, Chitra, Sibi, Ashraf, and Janelle, is to paint that picture for us, geographically, so to speak. So we're going to start furthest west on the continent, and we're going to start with you, Chitra, to talk us through the work that you've been doing in Mali specifically, but if you'd also want to share some additional insights from the Sahel, please feel free.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to be with you here today. I want to start with really stressing the need for climate security analysis that's context-specific based on my own experiences. So I had been working on peace and security in northern Nigeria and the Lake Chad Basin for 5 years before I started looking at climate security with Adelphi. And during that time, people talked about the impacts of climate change on conflict dynamics, but not really specifically painting what that meant in practice. And yet, when we did the assessment of climate security in the Lake Chad Basin, we found that there was so much there that we discovered just by going and talking to people affected by climate change, people affected by conflict, about their lives. And we published our Shoring Up Stability report on the basis of that, which has been, I think I'm right in saying, quite influential in terms of debates around climate security in the Lake Chad Basin. And going on to Mali, I think it's important to reflect about how sometimes these conversations that you have, and I work more on the qualitative conflict analysis side, can be as much of an art as it is a science. You're in interviews and you're having conversations with people, and really sometimes they mention something that makes you think, okay, this is interesting, and as a result you go and you probe further with them and with others and find something that really has not been discussed at all, either in the climate security space or in the conflict space. And I think a very good example of this was when I was in Mali last year. I was having a conversation with someone who was a fisherman, and we were talking about climate change and the impacts of climate change on his livelihood. And he mentioned just in passing, oh yes, and you know, one of the things that's happened is that because the farmers are using pesticides and herbicides, and the rains now come much stronger than before, with the first big rains of the season, all of this washes away into the water bodies, and then when we go to fish, most of our fish are dead that we catch. And that's really affecting our livelihoods. It's affecting relations between farmers and fisherfolk, and this is something that really was not mentioned in the discourse around climate security until you went and talked to people about the impacts of climate change and conflict on their lives. And that leads me to another point that I want to make, which is the real importance of when you're planning climate security assessments to try and ensure as much diversity as possible, diversity in geographical locations, but also the respondents that you're talking to. And I always, when I sit down with my colleagues to plan this work, ask, where are the places that are being affected by climate change, affected by conflict, who are the people living there, and then try and speak to as many different groups as possible, even if that means that people from minority groups are overrepresented in the sample. From a conflict analysis point of view, that's really important, and you end up finding things that you wouldn't know if you had just relied on the conversations that you have with those in power or those who are the dominant group. And I think that's really important to get the nuance of how climate change and conflict separately and together are affecting people.
Thanks a lot, Chitra. You've already introduced a bit around the Lake Chad Basin. So to our audience, if you can work with us here in imagining the African continent quite literally, we are journeying across the Sahel. It's by no coincidence that we're doing that and moving towards the Horn of Africa. Of course, in other sessions, we would cover other regions of the African continent, but this helps us to paint a stark picture of the context in which we work, but importantly, why it matters to be doing this kind of analysis to inform and shape policies. So, Ashraf, I'm moving to you, almost right next door, southeast of Mali, to Nigeria, for you to share your experiences from Nigeria, but of course we recognize a lot of the security impacts in particular in Nigeria have had a regional impact. So you're also welcome if you want to speak to what happens when there's instability, insecurity, but also climate security challenges in one country.
Yeah, and thank you very much. So in Nigeria, we've had critical climate risks manifesting into violence and conflict for a very long time now. I think mostly it manifests in the form of farmer-herder conflicts. I think mostly what we're more familiar with when we talk about Nigeria is more violent extremism. I think in terms of lethality, violent extremism, you know, in the modern history has had more casualties than any other type of conflict. But we'll be surprised to hear that in the last 2 years, the farmer-herder conflict is giving us many casualties, equaling the northeast of the country to what Boko Haram is doing. So it's killing more people per year than Boko Haram. And that's manifested in different ways. As a sector, as a development sector, humanitarian sector, we've tended to approach this problem from a peace angle, from a peace and security angle. So when it comes to conflict analysis, pure conflict analysis, analyzing the data, harnessing the data, we're quite advanced. But as a sector, we're playing catch up when it comes to climate risk data, how resilience matches up to the conflict analysis, and what that means for the conflicts. So in UNDP, we're approaching this now and trying to catch up in 2 areas. And for the sake of time, I will talk about these 2 areas, but feel free to approach me for more information on these, and I can share more documentation as to what we're doing. So firstly, we're using secondary data. We've started a process of using secondary data, specifically normalized difference vegetation index, that's the NDVI, and trying to cross that with farmer-herder conflict incidents. So trying to see whether there's correlation between the vegetation and conflict, and seeing whether there's a negative correlation or positive correlation. Essentially, we split the country into 3,000 different little grids and assessed it based on these indicators. And this is just one climatic indicator. What we've found is it points to two particular trends. In terms of seasonality, what we've seen over the last 20 years is that we've moved from primarily having farmer-herder conflicts in the dry season to having farmer-herder conflicts in the raining season. So we have started seeing movements of cattle, movements of herders towards the water because traditionally the soil is not able to now retain. So the soil essentially is becoming less arable and they have to move towards more pure water sources. Secondly, the association between the NDVI and conflict has shown a negative correlation. That is, as it increases, as NDVI increases, as vegetation increases, there is less conflict. And this sounds quite logical. It sounds quite easy, an easy assumption to make, but actually there hasn't been much data to show this. What we've seen is that the herder pathways that we traditionally know and have been used in the region and beyond Nigeria, this is trans-border, we've assumed that has been taken up by modern buildings, that people have now started owning land, and so those pathways, those herder routes are no longer herder routes. They're people's farms, they're people's land. Beyond that, what this research is showing is that actually it's beyond just people taking up that space. It's literally the land becoming less arable. And so we've seen that, and we're trying to bring out modeling statistics to try and see how much conflict is actually specifically affected. And I think we've seen so far that 1 unit increase in vegetation reduces significantly the number of conflicts. The second example I wanted to bring is actually something that's ongoing, and that's bringing climate security design principles into programming. And we're lucky to be working with one of the co-conveners of today's event, Adelphi, in doing a lot of what Lucas really just talked about. That's crossing some of the resilience data that we have with really locally rooted understanding of the context. That's both from a conflict and a climatic aspect. So we're developing a program that really ties this together. And one of the main functions of this program is going to be to develop resilience information systems data that's localized and that brings communities, both intra and inter communities, together. So data collection is not just an end in itself, but it's a peace means as well, bringing people together to collect data that's useful for those communities so that they can anticipate risks in rain variability, risks in weather, and how that can also be used in later climate adaptation programs, human resource management programs, et cetera, just harnessing those different types of data together.
Thank you very much, Ashraf. So we move to East Africa and the Horn. Now, Sibi, you've had extensive experience over close to 2 decades in Kenya, but even before that within Ethiopia with World Food Programme, working within the region, really questions related to climate action, resilient livelihoods, gender, but also around food systems, right? Fundamentally, the World Food Programme, the name, it almost goes without saying, is about food. So I'm coming to you now just to share your experiences from a World Food Programme perspective on this question around the importance of climate security risk assessments that can inform better strategies, planning, and projects.
That will help. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much. Correct. So I do work for the World Food Program. I work out of our Eastern Africa Regional Bureau that covers 10 countries in the region. And we work with about 34 million people. And most of this land, I would say over 70%, is arid and semi-arid lands. Most of the populations we work with, of course, we're a food assistance agency, so all these people are food insecure, and the reasons they're food insecure are varied. It's a vast presence, but it's also a very deep presence. We have hundreds of offices all over, and we work at the community level, as well as with national and local governments. So we're there day in, day out, seeing what's going on and really noticing some of the trends that my colleagues have mentioned. Interesting to note that most of the lands in which we work are populations that are traditionally marginalized, have historically been marginalized. Their lifestyles are agro-pastoral, as been mentioned, and pastoralism is a very adaptive livelihood strategy, actually. And water sources dry up. That has happened in the past. Many of the strategies, like migrating to water sources that traditionally, even in the driest of times, are still there, are no longer working. So we're seeing new dynamics, and you've heard about some of them here. If migration is your strategy and you're looking for a water source that's no longer available, you're going to start moving into areas that maybe you didn't before, and that's when you see these conflicts that we're hearing about. And it's shocking that there are more casualties from those kind of conflicts than from extremist conflicts. I think my time would be best spent just talking about some of the solutions. We do pride ourselves that we benefit from a lot of the theory and the analysis, but we specialize in what actually works on the ground and what doesn't work. So these investments in livelihoods, I can share a few of the examples. I think that would be useful because we've made the case for how they reduce conflict. So not only improving access to, let's say, water or creating it, whether that be boreholes or shallow wells and things like that, but also working with the governance of access to those resources, making sure that groups like women and even within the pastoral community, there can be different dynamics, making sure that access to that water is equal. Creating fodder sources, but using the latest science to talk about which kind of fodder may be best, may be resilient, increasing the amount of fodder that's available. Increasing access to veterinary services has proved important so that people can move their herds to where they need to go and retain the value of those herds. We've managed to ensure, I think, based on the same NDVI indices that my colleague was talking about, almost 500,000 people, and that includes pastoralists. Traditionally, microinsurance was only available for farmers, but we've worked with a range of partners to figure out how those insurance payouts can reach pastoralists and how they're most useful. Ecosystem-based restoration, looking at an area-based approach where several partners crowd in to provide different specialized services. I think the localization element is important. Local actors, local communities also have very good suggestions about how the natural resource base can be preserved, can be enriched, and how access to it can be equitable for all. I hope we'll get to talk about more of these solutions, but I'd like to stress that we need a range of partners working with local groups to make sure that we have the best thinking, the newest thinking about how to address some of these problems. We have to act quickly. It's very great that we have these studies and we're confirming and validating some of these assumptions. We need to turn that into action. And for us to do that, we need financing and resources. 73% of the need in our region is driven by conflict, but the money that we receive, and I think I speak for other actors also, doesn't always go to resilience building, to livelihoods at the scale that is needed. So really for us, this is a call to action so that we can really start to see some results on the ground. We are indeed running out of time if you've looked at the situation in the Horn these days. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And of course, the World Food Program just 2 years ago won the Nobel Peace Prize. And many would have wondered, but what's a World Food Program doing getting a prize for peace? But fundamentally, when people are fed and have access to improved livelihoods, the propensity perhaps towards violence and conflict reduces. I'm going to turn to you, Janelle. Janelle is the head of Regional Peace and Support Department at the Berghoff Foundation. Of course, your experience is across Africa, but you've done a lot of work specifically on Somalia. Previously, of course, supporting missions in Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, Afghanistan, and India. So we're calling to you, really, one, to share your experience specific on Somalia. But of course, this is more for the Q&A and discussion that's going to follow after Janelle, where questions are not limited to the countries that have been discussed. As you've heard from our speakers so far, the geographic reach extends beyond the examples we're using today. So please feel comfortable to be able to also raise issues outside of those countries. Janelle, on Somalia.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today and to be able to talk a bit about our work in Somalia. I'd like to focus today very specifically on a district called Beledweyne. It's located in Hirshabelle State. Beledweyne suffers from a great deal of climate insecurity, environmental degradation, and also quite a bit of political and social conflict. It's a very troubled district, and there are IDPs streaming into Beledweyne on a daily basis, and the situation is projected to get a lot more tense. We've been working in Beledweyne for many years, and we work very critically with a group of local peace builders. So these are people that are really embedded into the communities. They are from different social groups, different clans, and they have an access in Beledweyne that is really critical for the work that we do. And we've been doing capacity development measures with them over the years, most specifically and recently on climate security. So understanding the effect of climate change on communities, livelihoods, conflict, and using the methodology that we had developed together with Adelphi, and we used in a different climate risk assessment in Galmudug State. We really focused it in a very localized way in Beledweyne. So really carried out a great deal of consultations and focus group discussions with various people in the community to find out, their take, their perspectives on climate variability, their vulnerabilities, resources, resource sharing, and specifically one of the most interesting things that we investigated was adaptation techniques and maladaptation techniques in Beledweyne. So what are people doing to try to deal with these issues? And I would argue that this localized climate risk assessment was really fascinating and I would argue much more useful than a more broader climate risk assessment, because not only do the climate variabilities differ across regions in the same state, but the conflict dynamics are so fundamentally different in each district, and these inevitably have a lot of impact on climate insecurity. So in the end, our output from these consultations is really what's the interesting thing. We developed what we called a climate security action plan. And this is a document that really divides the various climate security issues that Beledweyne is dealing with into 4 topics. So drought, so lack of water, flooding, overabundance of water, environmental pollution, which is a very serious issue in Beledweyne. There's a lack of sanitation, and the river acts basically as the dump for the district's waste, and deforestation, which is extreme around the hills around Beledweyne. And each of these issues is broken down into sub-issues, and critically, we've been able to link what are the conflict issues connected to all of these climate security issues. And this is really, really important to be able to say, what do we do now? Where do we go from here? So we look at the plan as, it doesn't belong to us. It belongs to the community of Beledweyne. They are the ones that informed it. And in fact, once we developed this action plan, we went back and did validation sessions with the people in Beledweyne to really talk about what are the strategies. And this plan lays out short-term and long-term strategies for all of these issues, and talks really about the role that all of the actors can play. So it really needs a multidisciplinary effort. Peace-building organizations, development organizations, humanitarian organizations, the government, the district authorities, federal authorities, and really critically, local communities. So what can local communities do to really tackle these issues? And I would say it's sort of a call to action for Beledweyne to really have these actors come and become involved in the way forward for Beledweyne. And yeah, I'll leave it at there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Of course, Somalia is the first context under at least the UN where there has been a climate security advisor appointed. For me, knowing the context within Somalia and the decades in which the focus was on climate change issues over the security issues, it almost, if one were to look into a crystal ball in 1990, perhaps a lot of what we're seeing today in Somalia, Nigeria, Kenya, Mali, the Lake Chad Basin, and the Sahel could have been avoided if we had, at the time, weathering risk. So if we had an ability then to look at the context from a climate lens, but also to match it, as Janelle has played with us today, on also understanding the other dynamics, be they developmental, be they peace and security challenges. So not to operate in silos, so to speak, but to recognize that contexts are intricate, complex, and require levels of analysis that perhaps until now we haven't seen. Now, our session started about 10 minutes late, but I'm not going to be that moderator that steals 10 minutes from the next session, but I will steal 5. So we have about 25 minutes for questions as well as answers from the panel and a discussion. A reminder again, if you are tweeting this event, please @ClimateDiplo and use the hashtag BCSC 2022. So there will be a roving microphone. If you could, for those in the room, just indicate your interest in being part of the conversation by raising your hand. Please, if someone can go right to the person wearing white.
Good morning. Thank you so much for the excellent remarks. It's really helpful to hear the specific examples of where you're working on the ground. So one of the things, I'm Lauren Reese with the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. One of the things that we are thinking a lot about is how to connect levels of decision making, right? Recognizing that the decisions made at the international level are going to have cascading effects on communities on the ground and vice versa, and how to ensure that you're not just looking at the risks on the ground, but where there's resilience and where you can invest in that broader resilience. So I was wondering if you could sort of talk about how you're thinking about that, looking at these really local level challenges. But, so thinking about, for the colleague from the World Food Program, the Russia and Ukraine crisis is having cascading effects across the globe, including for food security in the Horn of Africa. And so how does that get incorporated into the analysis and into the response? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sibi, please.
The challenge to be brief while answering that particular question, but I would just say if you look at the COVID pandemic, for example, it showed that we're in such an interconnected world now, and so a shock in one part of the world, the Ukraine crisis, for example, immediately brings up prices of staple foods in all these areas. There's a lack of fertilizer, and now production is reduced, including in some of these conflict and climate-affected areas. I think, though, from these crises, you see a shift. So now, because of the Ukraine crisis, much more interest in local food systems, in indigenous foods, in biofertilizer, things like that. And it also galvanizes, I think, people a little bit. So the problem is that we need responses, short-term responses to very acute humanitarian situations. Those happen in capitals with decisions about funding, but they're implemented on the ground. If we have a true embrace of the localization agenda, as has been mentioned several times, you put people in the driving seat of what those solutions might look like at a very granular level. So you might provide an insurance payout, but maybe there's local advice about how that money is best used, maybe is one way to put it. It's the localization agenda, I think, is the answer to how we join up those. I've been under strict instructions to be brief.
Thank you very much. But I think if you can, Sibi, for the benefit of our audience, just go into one or two specific examples, drawing from the African continent where people can be able to kind of vividly see what this really means in practice when we talk about localization.
All right, so if I take example of anticipatory action is where a response is provided ahead of the actual shock based on an accurate forecast. So we have found that the best way to provide support or a safety net in this situation is to give a combination of, say, early warning about what's happening. That's a very localized, but through local channels that people actually can trust. You may also want to give cash, which enables people to meet their own idiosyncratic needs, whether those be water, whether that be not pulling a girl out of school. But then you also want to give access to some form of livelihood support. Again, fodder is such a big one, making sure that there are local actors, preferably women, medium and small women's groups that are actually growing that fodder. Those are some of the solutions that can be very local. We ask people, which risk, how do you rank your risk? And we might assume coming from the outside that water might be top of the list. In many of these areas, it's actually security that we found as a top in focus group discussions. People have concerns about security. You can understand why. They also want reliable climate information. What is the shock that's coming? What's the nature of it going to be? And the more we can do that, perhaps through some of the actors, like you mentioned in Beledweyne, people will start to believe it, to trust it, and then they'll take action accordingly. So really, we want to help people to protect themselves. There's often a lack of safety nets, whether they're from government or others in these areas. So the best thing we can do for the long term is help people to protect themselves based on localized knowledge and local solutions.
People should protect themselves based on localized knowledge and also localized solutions. Janelle, I'm going to turn to you, just specific on this question that has been posed. Obviously, that multi-layer approach and response. From your work and your experience, adding on to what has already been said by Sibi around the importance of localized knowledge and solutions, your take.
Thank you. I'll stick with Beledweyne as an example. I think one of the interesting things about Beledweyne is actually how active some of the community members are. You have, for instance, a local flood committee that is really active, and these are mainly business leaders that have, joined forces together, and they try to provide aid when flooding happens. And they take their job very seriously, and they're very proud of what they do, and they try to alleviate the suffering of the community when the floods happen. However, at the same time, this group of people is a self-declared group. They are mainly from one community in Beledweyne, and they don't, their access doesn't stretch to certain areas of the district, and obviously their actions are not necessarily interlinked with the district government as well. So you have a lot of different ways of people coming together and trying to support each other. Also in floods, like really the communities of Beledweyne reach out to each other and try to help each other as well, but there's really no coordination on this, and that's one of the main issues that I think is really, really important, especially in terms of early warning systems for flooding. You have early warnings that are coming in. The UN agencies know the floods are coming, but it doesn't trickle down to the people. And you always ask yourself, why? Why is this happening? And there's a lot of different reasons. There's trust deficits, but there's also a lack of faith that when people leave their houses, that they're not going to get looted and they're not going to get robbed while they're gone. I mean, so this leads to, this is from, the conflict between the different communities in Beledweyne. And so this lack of coordination has a lot of cascading effects, actually. And it's a very complex situation. And I think often the complexity of trying to figure out how to coordinate all these different actors leads to inaction. But I think we need to tackle this. I hope I answered the question.
No, thank you very much. And please remember to raise your hands if you've got any questions. Maybe just a point of reflection on this. You spoke about communities in Beledweyne not having access beyond perhaps even their district. Here we are sitting in Berlin, 9,000 kilometers from that very community, hearing those stories with UNDP in the room, the World Food Programme in the room, Bergdorf Foundation. Quite frankly, being able to spread that word beyond that community is a task that those of us who can go beyond those communities should be taking up. So kudos to you for doing that work within Somalia. Please.
Yes, hi. My name is Rashid from UNEP Somalia. I'm working with Bergdorf. But this question is for all the panels. We always talk about climate security and climate change. But I think the issue is that the nexus between the security, climate change, and environmental degradation is what we are missing. So my question to you is that if we have the grandfather of security, which is the environmental degradation, how are we going to tackle this, which basically we need a finance to, to those communities like Beledweyne to access so they can revitalize that land? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The question has been posed from UNEP in Somalia, but I'm going to ask Chitra and Ashraf to share your reflections from outside of Somalia in terms of how do you respond to these questions around environmental degradation. So it goes back to what we've been talking about, silo less, and maybe check your blind spots as well. So environmental degradation, your reflections on that.
Yeah, I think environmental degradation is one of the big climatic risk factors. As I mentioned, when it comes to farmer-herder conflicts, the resources that were once there, simply put, the resources that were once there are no longer there. It's very difficult to access these communities. I mean, nomads by nature move a lot. So it's very difficult to try and identify what it is that needs resuscitating and what it is that needs resuscitating when. But working with the more stationary communities, what we've tried to do is try and build in conflict-sensitive climate adaptation techniques. So for example, earth dams that have gone, and earth dams are primarily for herder communities. How do we resuscitate these in a conflict-sensitive manner? I don't think trying to resuscitate environmental degradation is the issue. Climate financing is more the issue, and I think doing it in a conflict-sensitive manner, in a way that it doesn't ignite more conflicts than it's trying to solve, is more the issue. But also through the resilient information systems, trying to localize a lot of the data, we're trying to see ways that we can further prevent the environmental degradation, because it's definitely not finished. I mean, we talk about how environmental degradation has affected the conflicts that we have now, but it also has the potential to exacerbate conflicts in the future. So how do we try and prevent environmental degradation moving forward? I think doing that with localized data solutions is more the track that we're going through.
Chitra.
Thank you very much for that question. And for really highlighting the importance of environmental degradation. And when we look at that, we can see how that climate change and conflict interact. And I want to talk here specifically about dynamics around deforestation, because in all the 5 countries, so Nigeria, Niger, Chad, Cameroon, and Mali, in which I have done these climate security assessments, this is a big issue that everybody talks about the increasing deforestation that we're seeing, how that's actually linked to conflict. So you see, as a result of conflict, displacement, so areas with higher population density, and therefore, as a result of that, and also because collecting firewood is now one of the only livelihoods that are sustainable. The areas around these towns or villages get completely deforested, which is an issue in terms of safety, because people are now walking longer and longer distances to get the firewood that they need, which is a risk, because they have a risk then from armed opposition groups, but also from the military, who think because they're in those areas that they're potentially their enemy. But it's also an issue in terms of the environment. And many people talk to me about how this dynamic had led to reduced soil quality, had affected rainfall. And so you see a number of ways that these factors interact. And I think really what we need to do about this is ensure that we integrate this into humanitarian action. And I'm very happy, Sibi, that you're on the stage with me, because I think this is where humanitarian actors have really been getting better. I know a few years ago in Nigeria, you would have humanitarian actors delivering food, but not helping communities have what they needed to cook this food, which meant that we had this dynamic that people were literally getting killed or raped or abducted or being made disabled because they were walking outside to try and collect firewood. And I see now more and more humanitarian actors are taking this into account. Of course, much more is needed on that. And also we need to make sure that the action that we take to address environment and climate issues doesn't then drive conflict further. And we see this in Mali, where the OIFORE, which has been going for many decades now, since the 1980s has become much more militarized, armed with uniforms, and the forests are a source of resilience for people, especially poor communities, when there is disruption in their livelihood strategies because of climate, because of conflict, and the combination of the two. And if the answer of the government then is to crack down on people who are going to the forests, to charge them exorbitant rates in fines, engage in physical violence, engage in sexual violence, it's not then a surprise that grievances against the state increase. And it's then not a surprise. I don't want to draw a simple causal link between this and recruitment into armed groups, but armed groups in Mali are using this in their rhetoric to try and recruit people and encourage people to either join them or support them or at least not be against them. So I think this is really important. So thank you very much for raising this question of environmental degradation. It's really important.
Thank you. Lucas, an opportunity to respond, and then we will have time for two final questions, one here and then one in the middle of the room. But first to you, Lucas.
No, I just wanted to, I think it's a really important question, this on environmental degradation and how much is that part of the climate security agenda. Because as much as we don't want the climate security agenda to take away any attention from root causes such as governance and exclusion and marginalization, we also don't want us to limit us to just climate change related environmental issues. So really it's really important if we do these kind of assessments to look at environmental degradation that's climate related and also other things that might not be directly climate related. I mean, small scale mining, for example, is one of those examples that do shape the security context, are a major environmental issue, and we need to take those into account in our assessments, so should not limit us. And then going a bit, what you said, the other way around, it's really important to also understand as part of these assessments how conflict is affecting environmental degradation. And you brought the deforestation examples from Mali and also Lake Chad. I've done some work on Colombia and broadening it a bit. And after the peace accord there, we could see that deforestation in protected areas went through the roof, the highest rate since years. And that was because the government was not quick enough to move in when armed groups demobilized. Illegal, smaller armed groups took over and they started cutting down the forest. So it's really important to also look at the other side of how conflict drives environmental degradation and how that then drives climate change again.
Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. I'm Charlene Burton with Search for Common Ground. Thank you so much. It's great to hear from you. I have a question about the funding mechanisms that you use in the work that you're doing and whether you feel that they're appropriate with what's needed. So I heard a lot about the need for granular information, about nuance, about taking the time to have quality conversations. I heard about preparedness. I wonder whether the funding that is available to you, be it the UN or a civil society organization, usually 18-month funding, not renewable or really difficult to renew, whether you feel that it's appropriate for what's needed. And I think we have the benefit of having a lot of our supporters and donors in this room, so I'm wondering whether you have a message for them about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then the final question, right in the middle of the room. Please, if you can raise your hand so the person running with the mic can be able to reach you. Have you lowered your hand? Then we change. Final question. Great to seize the opportunity.
Okay. Thank you very much for the insights and for discussion. Actually, I have one specific question. We know all that responding to natural disaster is rather challenging. And I have here since yesterday and today about the warning system. So I would like to hear from your side one example from the area, from actual life, how the warning system is useful and how far help in this context. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I turn to the panelists in the order in which you spoke. So first to Chitra, your response to these questions around funding, sustainability, and then also the use of early warning systems. The briefer you are, the less the people in the session after us are upset with us.
Okay, I'll be very quick. Charlene, there you are, thank you. I think my short answer to your question is no. I don't think that the funding mechanisms that are here are actually what we need. There's a real need for long-term, sustainable, flexible funding and more money to go to NGOs and community-based organizations that are closest to the community, so local NGOs and CBOs, and that is still not happening despite years of commitment around the localization of humanitarian development, peace-building action. And I think that it's a shame because that's something that we're all committed to, and yet that is still not happening. I'm going to pass on the second question so that others are able to speak.
Perfect. Ashraf.
I think you'll be hard pressed to find a UN worker that will say that they don't have a problem with funding. And secondly, I think I have to be very careful because I'm right in the home of one of our funders. But on a serious note, yeah, I think when it comes to funding mechanisms, basically, yeah, there's a problem. Climate is a very slow process, right? And especially when it's fused with conflict and trying to amend root causes, it can be even slower. But what we're trying to do is, in one of the projects I just described, actually, is we're trying to really focus on area-based programming. So we're trying to focus our resources intensely on a particular area, so that we have a pilot, we have a proof of concept, so that the money stretches further. Even if it's just a handful of people that we can see proof of a concept working or not working, we think that goes further than stretching it a little bit more. So that's one of the ways that we're doing that. On early warning, I don't really have particular examples that I can give you, but I can definitely, I mean, if I to come in from the conflict side, I don't think that's the answer that you're looking for. From an environmental side, I can definitely connect you with those responsible for that.
Thank you. Sibi.
And I've got my eye on that ticking clock. I would say, in answer to the funding, you mentioned WFP is actually a nexus actor. So yes, you probably know us for our humanitarian response, but we actually stay in communities for a long time and invest in a lot of climate security is a definition, a nexus issue. There are attributes of humanitarians that are very useful in this context, so they are familiar with the concepts of risk and risk management, vulnerability, how it involves prioritization of need. But it's also driven by short-term funding. By definition, the funding that you get from a humanitarian source is a one-year cycle. There's not much you're doing. In fact, you're doing nothing to build resilience or enhance livelihoods or address root causes in 1 year. Climate financing takes you about 2 years to access. It goes through different structures. It goes through national governments when often these problems are at the very local level with very marginalized populations. And it has to be specifically tied to climate issues. So you cannot apply. We recently applied for a grant for deforestation in Senegal. They said this is not a climate issue. This is a development issue. So there are constraints around accessing climate finance. If you can have humanitarian funding for humanitarian response, but alongside it, you have money for resilience. And by the way, Germany is the biggest donor to WFP in terms of resilience and environmental action. So we're very grateful and very happy to be here. So basically, the funding doesn't work, but it can be made to work if there's flexibility and a combination of humanitarian response, but resilience and livelihood investments at the same time. Very quickly on early warning, I have a concrete example for you. Anticipatory action means that donors pre-identify finance and set it aside on the basis of forecast. forecasts, which are a form of early warning. We've had early warning for many years. What we don't have is the early action to follow the early warning. So I think there's a consensus. The World Meteorological Organization, oh my goodness, says that the whole world will be covered with early warning information in 5 years, which is great, but let's make sure to work together to make sure that there is action to follow that early warning, otherwise it's useless. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you. Janelle.
Okay, I think I might have to take more than 19 seconds, but just to answer Charlene's question as well, I think, yes, my short answer is also no, but I think a lot of us has already been said about the need for long-term and flexible funding, but I would also like to add to what was said about the multidisciplinary aspects of this type of work. And as an organization that's really focused on conflict transformation, we run into the wall quite a bit. I mean, we do not have the capacity in our mandate to work on development issues or humanitarian issues or climate issues. And it's interesting to sit here in this room because we're sitting here with all of our partners, Adelphi, the German Foreign Office, UNDP, who kindly supported the work in Beledweyne, United Nations Environment Program. And you can see how multidisciplinary this is, but our funding is often earmarked and comes from certain donors, and it's really hard to develop what we do together with, livelihood programs, and that is really a challenge that we're dealing with, and that we, ask the donor community to think about. And I would like to say one small thing, and it's a positive thing. I'll leave the panel on a positive note about environmental degradation, and we've done quite a lot of work on climate security over the past couple years, and this issue of environmental degradation is a really interesting one because it has a different effect on the people. When you talk about climate change with Somalis, it's always about, oh, this is not something that we're responsible for. This is something that the Western industrialization nations has brought to us. But when you talk about environmental degradation, it has a different effect. The charcoal production has simply ravaged Somalia, and Somalis have done this. And because they realize they sort of got themselves into this situation, it really gets them thinking about their own agency and getting themselves out of it, and it really motivates them. And I think that's a really important point that I'd like to leave you with.
Thank you very much. You've heard from our panel this morning, again, re-stressing the point of why context matters, but importantly, why context analysis is important for policy, programming, strategy development. We can't do any of that without funding to do it, whether it's the World Food Programme, the UNDP, the Berger Foundation, independent researchers, or Adelphi. It's a lot of work that needs to be done. Perhaps to borrow a bit from Janelle and ending on a positive note, it's recognizing that the issues we're discussing are interconnected, and so too should the solutions. We've spoken about integration, localization, collaboration, preparedness, being informed by evidence. We've spoken also about the importance of learning and listening, understanding that the best way in order for us to be able to weather the risk and move from risk to resilience relies on talking to the right people on the ground, developing the right kind of solutions, and sharing them. So to our panelists, who all come from different organizations working in different contexts, what they've done with you this morning is share those experiences and hope that you can be able to do that as well beyond this room. I, of course, end with apologies because I feel like this discussion could have gone on for much longer, but we only had an hour, technically 55 minutes. And we've been able, I think, from the panel to do quite a good job in helping paint the picture on the African continent. I'll end with this because my region was not discussed and I'm the moderator, so I can be able to abuse the privilege. Coming from Southern Africa, which is the region that will see the highest in temperature increases over the next 50 years, often it goes without saying that for us, questions of climate change are not theoretical. Understanding what potential could lie ahead for conflict is not theoretical. We have seen what has happened in the Lake Chad Basin, in the Horn of Africa, in the Sahel. We are seeing what is happening in the north of Mozambique, communities affected by drought, flooding, high impact climate impacts, but also environmental degradation, pollution in countries like Madagascar, Malawi, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Tanzania, and South Africa. We recognize that these are challenges for us today. It's one thing to talk about it. My plea as a Southern African, as an African, is we ought to draw on what has been said today and what we're going to hear for the remainder of this Berlin Climate Security Conference to actually do something about it. Localized action, localized response, but draw on the expertise continentally, internationally, to be able to do that. It's 10:23. To the next session, I'm sorry. To all of you, thank you.